When we compare and contrast the Gospels to other ancient documents, what do we see?
I think what you're getting at is an argument that has commonly been used to compare New Testament manuscripts as a whole to other ancient documents, largely made popular by New Testament scholar F.F. Bruce. It basically goes something like this. When you compare the number of handwritten copies, the manuscripts we have for the New Testament, with the number of copies from other ancient writers, and compare the time when we think the originals were written to the time when we have our first surviving copies, and when they can be dated, there's quite a disparity. We have approximately 23,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, and we're waiting somewhere between 40 to 70 years for the first surviving copies to pop up. Whereas if you compare that with, say, Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, we have about 2,500 copies of Homer, and we're waiting around 500 years for our first copies of those to pop up. Now, right at the offset, my first and initial disclaimer is I do not think that we should popularize or encourage this argument, particularly online. And I also need to say that I'm guilty of doing that myself in the past. The caveat to that caveat is that I think this argument does have a strength. It shows that we need to be fair in our assessment of biblical documents compared with the copies of other ancient writers. That we can't have this ultra skeptical view of the New Testament, reading it with that lens, and yet take the writings of Plato and Homer and Herodotus and Sophocles and Xenophon at face value. That would be a double standard. I do think we need to be very careful with the argument, because we have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to prove? Are we saying that because there are more copies of the New Testament and that they are earlier, that then the Bible is accurate, reliable, inspired, and infallible? Because that's a leap in logic that doesn't totally compute. If we found a stash of 40,000 copies of Plato's Republic, and they happen to be from, let's say, the year 380 BC, which is only 5 years after we think that that document was probably authored, does that mean that Plato is now divinely inspired and more accurate and reliable and trustworthy than the Bible? No, unequivocally, it does not. So the argument has value, but only in showing that we need to have equal scales in our assessment of ancient literature. The other pitfall we need to avoid when applying this argument is using the most up-to-date and accurate numbers for the Bible and then using outdated numbers for other ancient writers. Types of graphs and ways that I've seen this articulated online often uses F.F. Bruce numbers from the book The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? You have up-to-date numbers for when that book was written. However, that book was published in the 1940s, and just as the number of manuscripts of the New Testament have grown since then, so have the number of other ancient writers. And what those graphs often do is they go online and they find the most updated numbers for the New Testament, but they stick with the numbers from F.F. Bruce's book, which are horribly and wildly out of date. The other problem we fall into is that people don't often realize, and I didn't realize this till I started getting into my formal study in fields like papyrology and paleography and manuscript studies, is that New Testament studies applies and counts the inclusive number of manuscripts, and classical scholars often count what's referred to sometimes as the functional number of manuscripts. So in other words, a good portion of our oldest copies of these types of documents are fragmentary. Some of them are only small scraps that still survive today. Here's an example of one that I made myself. This is a facsimile, so that's a copy of a credit card size section of the Gospel of John. On the front, it has John chapter 18, verses 31 to 34, and on the back, it has John chapter 18, 37 to 38. A lot of our manuscripts look like this. Not all of them are entire copies of books. Some of them are scraps, because these things are thousands of years old sometimes. What we're dealing with is small scraps that still survive today, and generally New Testament scholarship tries to assemble and assign a categorized system to all of these documents. Classicists, on the other hand, almost only ever count the number of copies they actually use to read from functionally. So what we end up with is comparing apples to orchards. The New Testament is reliable. It is the most attested document within all of antiquity. There are good arguments to defend its veracity, its historicity. We don't need to use arguments like these comparative analyses.